April 5, 1943, Vancouver, Washington. Kaiser Shipbuilding Company Yard, United States Navy Bureau of Ships. The river is grey and cold, the slip is dressed with bunting, torchlight skitters across fresh plate, a name is chalked on the prow, Casablanca. The sponsor steps forward, the bottle breaks, the hull moves, a new kind of carrier slides into the current, and the clock starts to run. From this launch on April 5, 1943 to the last launch on May 27, 1944, 50 Sisters, will follow an unbroken procession that turns steel and steam into sea power at a tempo few believed possible. Launches, not commissions, the first of the class, joins the fleet in July 1943, and the 50th is commissioned by July 1944, production first, then cruise, then sorties. The architects stand in shadows behind the ceremony. Welders, riggers, platers, pattern makers, yard planners with slide rules and pocket notebooks. They speak in schedules and tolerances. They count minutes. They cut the ship into parts, then turn the parts into a line. Pre-fabricated sections arrive like boxcars of purpose, bulkheads already drilled, stanchions already fitted. A flight deck that grows yard by yard as if poured from time itself. This is not a single ship. This is a system that makes ships. The idea is simple. The execution is ruthless. The result is speed. These carriers are not queens. They are workers. Escort carriers, Casablanca-class. Small hangars stacked with aircraft like a travelling workshop. Light protection. Merchant standards. Engines chosen because America needs rare gear sets elsewhere, so the yards reach for what the nation has in volume, proven reciprocating steam machinery, and push forward. The trade is deliberate. Build many. Build now. Put decks wherever convoys sail and Marines must land. Fill the sea lanes with fighter cover and patrol eyes. The Pacific is large. The Atlantic is lethal. The answer is quantity, with enough quality to fight. The first months feel impossible. Then rhythm takes hold. Sections march down the ways on cranes and rollers. Rivets crackle like rain. Sparks fall like meteors. A hull number becomes a name. A name becomes a crew list. A crew list becomes sorties that will one day cover an amphibious beach or hammer a submarine wake and call out a contact bearing. The river never empties. The tide carries success out. It brings raw plate back in. Between April 5, 1943 and May 27, 1944, Henry Kaiser's Vancouver yard launches 50 escort carriers, near one per week, while other American yards convert and complete still more. The arc of a year bends to production. Across the ocean, confidence sits in map rooms and staff lectures. In post-war interrogations, senior Japanese naval leaders, including Admiral Soemu Toyoda, acknowledged that American production capacity and the ability to keep schedules proved decisive. Before those admissions, planners had discounted the depth of U.S. shipbuilding trusting spirit and a decisive battle to outweigh material tempo. The record that follows from this river answers that miscalculation in steel. The calendar becomes a ledger. Hulls launched. Hulls commissioned, decks at sea. The message is simple. If the nation decides, the yards will deliver. By early 1943, the sea itself is the threat. In the Atlantic, tankers and freighters burn inside the grey arc. Sailors call the air gap. In the Pacific, every island on the map is a runway that must be taken under friendly skies. Big deck fleet carriers are already spoken for, tasked to punch hard at decisive points. But the convoys, the amphibious lines of departure, and the empty miles between them, need something humbler and more numerous. The order that takes shape is blunt-put flight decks wherever the nation's logistics must pass, and do it on a calendar measured in weeks. Constraints are the stakes sharpened. Turbines and precision gear sets are prioritized for destroyers, cruisers, and Essex-class carriers. Steel mills run hot. Trained shipfitters are scarce. The U-boat campaign punishes any delay. The answer cannot be a boutique ship. It has to be a pattern. Bureau of Ships and Kaiser planners settle the trade quickly. Merchant standards. Where warship standards are not critical, a compact reciprocating steam plant that industry can produce in volume and a hull designed from the first pencil line. to be cut into pieces, moved by crane and welded back into speed. If the system works, convoys cross whole and beachheads breathe. If it fails, schedules on land mean nothing at sea. The program gives the pattern a name, Casablanca. It is less a single ship than a decision about how America will fight time. The mold loft becomes a factory for parts the size of rooms. Bulkhead panels arrive, drilled and labelled. Machinery blocks drop into bays prepared yesterday on a different hull. Yard cranes learn the choreography faster than any one crew can describe it. The rhythm is stamped into chalk marks and shift whistles instead of speeches. Workers rotate through classes, then straight onto the way's riveters who become welders, welders who become lead hands who become planners because the line cannot wait. The calendar is the tyrant and the ally. Elsewhere, the war keeps score, while the yards count minutes. U-boats want the spring and summer of 1943 for a last harvest. Hunter-killer groups need more decks to close the gap. In the Central Pacific, operations names already exist on briefing slides. Gilbert, Marshall, Marianas, and each arrow demands fighters overhead when weather and luck go bad. Marine divisions can take a beach only if anti-submarine patrols keep transports intact and combat air patrols keep low, slow workhorses alive. The modest dimensions of an escort carrier are a feature here, small enough to proliferate, fast enough to make wind for a launch, long enough to recover the pilot who found a periscope or a mortar team at the waterline. This is where the title's tension lives. Across the ocean, confidence had rested on the idea that spirit could outrun material. Pre-war lectures and wartime briefings leaned on the decisive blow and the will to deliver it. The American response is not a single blow. It is output attached to purpose. A weekly launch is not a headline. It is a convoy arriving with its escorts unspent. A dozen identical engine rooms are not romance. They are maintainers solving problems in minutes because every ship they touch looks like the last one. Quantity does not replace quality here. It supplies it reliability, as a tactic interchangeability, as a weapon. The yard math becomes fleet math. One hull on the river becomes 4 squadrons in the plan. 4 squadrons multiply into an ocean screen that shifts with the convoys and the assault shipping. When a beachhead flexes and starts to bow, the nearby escort carriers do not ask the big decks for help if they can avoid it. They turn into the wind and make their own. When a wolf pack tests a slow convoy at night, a CVE with a patient radar plot and a handful of pilots who have learned to fly by instruments over black water, can break the pattern, find, fix and force submergence before dawn. Every constraint that forced the design is now an advantage at scale. Merchant-grade structure means faster fabrication and repair. Reciprocating machinery means parts from suppliers who can flood the pipeline. A standardized island and deck plan mean crews that rotate between ships without learning a new language each time. Where a single loss would have been catastrophic at the beginning of the war, the line behind it is already building the replacement. The message to operations is simple. Plan on having decks. Plan on keeping them. The stakes sit in numbers that never appear on a monument. Flight hours logged over anonymous seas, convoy serials that arrive on time, ammunition ships that do not detonate because a patrol plane called Periscope 10 minutes earlier than last month, amphibious timelines that hold because close air support launches from 10 miles off the beach instead of 100. What looks like modest steel on a short hull is actually slack in the system, the margin that lets an army land on the right day and a fleet maneuver on its own schedule. So the context narrows to a river, a set of ways, and a list pinned to a planner's board. If America can turn drawings into hulls in roughly a year, 50 of them identical enough to be interchangeable, then the ocean stops being a place where schedules go to die. It becomes infrastructure. That is the wager the program makes. That is the threat it answers. And that is why what happens between April 1943 and May 1944 is not backdrop, it is the fulcrum that lifts everything else. The program is arithmetic before it is legend. Start date April 5, 1943. End date for launches May 27, 1944. Output 50. Casablanca-class escort carriers from a single riverfront complex at Vancouver, Washington, roughly 1 launch per week, while other yards convert or complete still more decks. Clarifier launches first commissions to fleet soon after the lead ship joins in July 1943. The 50th is in service by July 1944. The title's hinge 50 in 1 year is not a metaphor. It is a calendar you can stack on a planner's board. The method is the message. Bureau of Ships and Kaiser engineers do not chase bespoke perfection. They standardize. Frames, bulkheads, galleries, and machinery foundations are cut and drilled off the ship, labelled and moved by crane as prefabricated blocks. Weld seams replace slow joinery. The mould loft becomes a production line, parts sized like rooms, choreography timed in minutes, not days. Merchant-grade standards are chosen where combat loads allow, and a compact reciprocating steam plant abundant in industry replaces scarce turbine gear sets reserved for destroyers, cruisers, and Essex-class carriers. The trade is deliberate, build many now, without starving other critical hulls. A Casablanca is small by design, so it can be everywhere. Typical air group fighters and torpedo bombers, FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, enough to keep a combat air patrol overhead and to launch ASW searches that push U-boats under by day and harass them by night. The flight deck is short. The doctrine compensates. Wind is made by turning into it. Launch cycles are brief. Recovery is constant. Quantity supplies quality here. Reliability through interchangeability. Tempo through repetition. Readiness through parts common to dozens of sister ships. Cadence becomes a tactic. A hull sliding every 7 to 10 days means convoys sail with organic air cover instead of pleading for a fleet carrier. It means hunter-killer groups can form around CVEs without stripping striking power from the main Pacific thrust. It means that when an amphibious line of departure starts to bend under weather or counterattack, nearby escort carriers, not big decks 100 miles away, turn into the wind and put fighters overhead in minutes. What looks modest on paper is operational slack, made real-time proximity and persistence. The supply chain is the unseen flight deck. Railcars arrive with pumps, valves, and fittings that match drawings across the entire class. A crew trained on one ship can fix the next without learning a new language. Yard schools compress skills into weeks. Workers step from classrooms to night shifts. Third-shift floodlights make the calendar itself a tool. Risk is managed, not romanticized hospitals, first aid huts, weld test coupons, inspector die, and light speed without drift becomes a cultural rule, not a speech. Across the ocean, the contrast hardens. Staff rooms that once leaned on spirit and a decisive battle meet a ledger of launches and commissions they cannot offset. The point is not that one ship defeats an idea. The point is that 50 ships in 1 year turn an idea underestimating America's shipbuilding depth into an operational error, with consequences measured in convoys arriving beachheads, held submarines kept under. The river at Vancouver does not argue. It delivers. They arrive before the horn. Lunch pails, tool belts, gloves tucked into back pockets like folded flags. The yard wakes as a single organism that breathes smoke and steam, and a ship's day begins in the mould loft, where chalk lines stretch across a floor polished by boots. Curves bloom into frames, numbers become ribs and decks, yesterday's drawings become today's cuts. A burner leans in, and the torch sighs the first orange seam of the morning opening like a fuse for everything that follows. Welding is a language you learn in heat. Shielded metal for backbone seams, gas where the joint is thin and fussy. New processes when speed and penetration make the difference between on schedule and we slip. A good welder hears truth in the puddle. The sound tells you if the angle is right before the bead even cools. Clamps and dogs bite down. A hammer convinces the stubborn inch. The plate relaxes. Riveting keeps its own music. The heaters toss, the dollies catch, the rattle and answer as two hands make one watertight head. From the street, the shop is noise. Inside, it is choreography. Fitters trust the level more than pride. Electricians lace cable trays that snake like arteries. The lights come alive bay by bay. Pipe fitters chase runs through steel that was still chalk last week. Steam, fuel, fire main, every flange faced true, every gasket seated, so a leak dies under fluorescent glare instead of North Atlantic sleet. Carpenters build the forms and guards that keep steel honest. Their work vanishes by launch and leaves only strength behind. Above them, the crane crew floats entire rooms through cold air. A signalman lifts 2 fingers, the skyline bends to the hook, and a block kisses home within a thumb's width of perfect. Danger is next door, not far away. A plate swings fast when wind turns, a boot skates once on an oil oval, and a back remembers for years. First aid huts wait without romance. The safety man is unpopular until the one day he is essential. Then his ledger is a roll of names that did go home. The yards are schools that do not look like schools. Apprentices learn the hard truths. First measure twice, clean the joint, ask before the lift. A good crew raises a ship. A great crew raises a generation. Women shoulder stations that habits once guarded. A fitter checks her square nods across the seam, and the seam does not care who runs the bead, only whether it will hold when green water climbs the bow. Black crews step through gates that opened slowly. Skill pries them wider. The ship does not sort courage by colour. The tide does not grade by surname. Pay envelopes turn into grocery lines and rent paid. Churches fill with hands that carry the fine black dust of a week's heat in their palms. In the Union Hall, a new card welder studies for the night class that will move her from hand to lead. Shift whistles fold the hours, and the river marks the week with launches. A hull number becomes a name becomes a crew list becomes sorties, because the work here connects to a deck somewhere far off the river, where the wind is a tool and minutes are ammunition. An FM2 sits at the waist of a small flight deck in weather that smells like rain and salt. The ship turns into the wind, the LSO's paddles dip, the pilot breathes once and rolls in power. The deck is short, the schedule is not 2 more behind him, 3, to recover a search pattern to fly, because a convoy somewhere stern quarter left has a silence in its wake that might be a periscope. Below, an Avenger crew rigs depth bombs live. The ordnanceman's hands move with the same economy as the pipe fitters back in Vancouver. The safety pin finds home because habit put it there. In the CIC, a radar scope blooms a faint echo. The talker's voice is calm in a way that only repetition can teach. Contact, bearing, range. The ship's own welds hum at speed. The island placement the engineers argued over, back in the loft sheds, the wind just enough for recovery. The little carrier does what it was built to do, put eyes out where there would have been only water. When the pilot finds the wake and calls it clean, when the TBM drops and the sea lifts in white fists, when the periscope vanishes before evening because a tired crew on a modest deck made the ocean bigger than a wolf pack's reach, that victory began in chalk and torch light upriver. The convoy will arrive with its tankers unspent and its ammunition ships intact, not because a single duel decided it, but because a calendar back home refused to slip, and a class of ships existed in numbers that turned presence into policy. Across the ocean, staff rooms once lectured that spirit could outrun material, that a decisive blow would make arithmetic irrelevant. The yards here never argued. They answered with a rhythm that did not need applause. A launch each week. A crew trained for sameness because sameness made reliability. An engine room any mechanic in the class could understand on the first night aboard. Quantity did not excuse quality. It supplied it. Interchangeable parts meant shorter repairs. Standardized decks meant pilots moved ship to ship and flew the same pattern by muscle memory in rain. The danger and the pride travel with the hull. A captain rings for more speed and the hull answers with a steady climb. Somewhere a welder wipes steel dust from his tray and does not know why he smiles. A mess deck laughs at a bad joke in the green glow of blackout lights. Somewhere a rigger's retirement cake is cut beside a bulletin about a new welding test. The river never empties. The tide carries success out and brings raw plate back, and the crews step through the gate again tomorrow because the calendar still asks. This is the human edge inside the statistic the title carries. 50 escort carriers in roughly a year is not a miracle. It is a million practiced motions joined to a plan multiplied by planners who listened to the shop and paid off by deck crews who turn that plan into convoys that live to see land. Presence at sea is built by hands on land. The myth prefers a duel. The workers prefer output. The fleet prefers presence. Across the ocean the plan was older than the ships that carried it. Staff rooms taught a single hard truth for a generation: seek a decisive battle, break the enemy's main force, end the war in one stroke. Spirit would outrun material, skill would cancel numbers, precision would defeat speed. That faith shaped budgets, training, and the way officers read maps. It also shaped an assumption that an industrial democracy could not keep tempo once losses mounted and oceans lengthened the supply line. The miscalculation was not loud. It was quiet, confident, and wrong. The arithmetic underneath that confidence was brittle. Fuel stocks were thin. Access to bauxite, alloying metals, and high-grade lubricants narrowed as the war widened. Machine tools and precision gear sets could not be summoned by decree. Quality concentrated in a few prized hulls and airframes, each one expensive in materials and time. The doctrine matched the economy: conserve, prepare, strike once with exquisite force, and pray that the calendar bends. It left little slack for replacement, little patience for repetition, and little respect for an enemy that could choose scale without choosing fragility. American yards answered in a different grammar: standardization, first substitution, where it made sense, and a design that fit the nation's supply chain instead of the other way around. A compact reciprocating plant that industry could flood. Merchant standards where they would not compromise survival. A flight deck sized for fighters and patrol bombers that could launch in any weather a modest ship could make wind to meet. The point was not elegance. The point was presence, and presence multiplies. The calendar made the theory visible. From early April 1943 to late May 1944, the river at Vancouver launched 50 escort carriers and taught the fleet to think in cadence rather than occasions. In the Atlantic, the change felt immediate. Hunter-killer groups formed without asking a fleet carrier to abandon a strike. The air gap shrank under patterns flown by FM2 seconds, and Avengers from decks that existed because a planner could count on them. Convoys began to measure risk in hours of daylight patrols and night radar plots, instead of in prayers over black water. In the Central Pacific, the same cadence turned arrows on briefing maps into guarantees. The Gilberts in November 1943. The Marshalls in January 1944. The Marianas in June. Close air support lifted off from 10 or 20 miles offshore when weather curled the lip of a beach and counterattack tried to throw Marines and soldiers back into the surf. The little carriers did not ask the big decks to come down off the horizon if they could help it. They turned into the wind and made their own margin. Post-war rooms of interrogation and analysis would admit what wartime rooms of confidence had not anticipated: the United States could keep schedules. It could replace losses faster than an opponent could create them. It could take a design, break it into pieces, and produce it at a rate that turned a ship from a singular asset into a reliable unit of planning. That reliability is the quiet edge inside the title's claim. 50 escort carriers in roughly a year is not a boast. It is a correction written in steel to a belief that spirit alone could outrun arithmetic. The lesson travels both ways across time. A navy that ties doctrine to rare jewels risks fighting the war it hopes for. A navy that ties doctrine to repeatable output fights the war it gets. The Casablanca program chose repeatable output and gave commanders something more useful than a miracle: a schedule they could trust.